Thanks for tuning in to The Wrong Kind of Black. My plan is to tell you in this episode why I no longer identify as a liberal. I feel as though the world is divided between the left and the right, but I believe that it's a lot more nuanced than that. So for instance, just because I believe that a 10-year-old shouldn't be allowed to undergo life-changing surgery to attempt to change their sex, it shouldn't mean that I'm a Nazi. Why? Well, it's easy to just call me a Nazi, because if I'm a Nazi, well, you can simply dismiss everything I say thereafter. And instead of it being the case that I'm compassionate enough to worry about the very same child potentially feeling suicidal later in life, which would be worse than denying a 10-year-old the right to undergo irreversible surgery, you could just label me as a fascist instead, who subscribes to the belief that all homosexuals, blacks, disabled, old, Mexican, Jews, and women should be thrown in a gas chamber to be incinerated. What a fucking cop-out. I find it ironic as well being black and gay, because if I say anything that doesn't fit the narrative of the far left, liberals find themselves a bit stuck on what the fuck to call me. So instead, blacks in America have come up with the Uncle Tom derogatory term, which refers to black people as being a sellout, a defect, or a traitor, if you like. So for anyone who hasn't read the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which by the way is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, Uncle Tom was actually a deeply religious, kind and noble slave. He's portrayed as a Christ-like figure who embodies patience, humility and unwavering faith in God despite having endured extreme cruelty by one of his masters. He's known for his gentle nature, moral integrity and compassion for others, including his fellow slaves and masters. And despite the suffering under one of his master's cruelty, Uncle Tom still refused to betray his fellow slaves or renounce his faith up until his death. So it always confused me as to why black people refer to other blacks as traitors, since Uncle Tom was actually extremely loyal to his fellow slaves. Then I realised that his character must be widely misinterpreted as a subservient slave just because he had a good relationship with some of his masters. What happened was he was actually freed by one of his masters, but before his master could sign the paperwork, his master was killed. The master's wife then decided to sell Tom to a notoriously bad plantation known for its cruelty, which is where Uncle Tom eventually dies. The funny thing is, the whole time I read this book, I assumed that the writer must have been black. I think my mind just associated the name Harriet with Harriet Tubman. But when I found out the woman who wrote the book was white, I was unsurprised why Abraham Lincoln told Harriet Beecher Stowe when he met her in person that this was the book that started the war, in reference to the American Civil War, which of course culminated in the emancipation of the slaves. So people who call other black people Uncle Tom are just inherently ignorant, and you can assume they don't know anything about his actual character or the book. It's my understanding that it's used to offend people, just because there are genuinely racist black people who hate white people for their ancestors having been subjected to slavery by white people's ancestors, and that any black person who doesn't manifest resentment towards that is not proud of who they are or where they came from. There's no such term for gay people, so normally what happens if a gay person says anything against the LGBTQ narrative, they're placed in a social hierarchy of oppression, which Kimberly Crenshaw calls intersectionality, which basically puts what society deems as the most socially marginalised group at the top of the hierarchy, that would be a gay, transgender, black, disabled woman, and the least marginalised group at the bottom, which would be a white, heterosexual male. So then someone like me, who's both black and gay, will be automatically deemed to be oppressive of anyone above me in this bullshit hierarchy. So that would be a female, black, gay woman or above. So if you haven't cottoned on yet, you can probably tell why I am no longer a liberal. What I've noticed being on both sides of the political spectrum is that the differences are largely philosophical. So what do I mean by philosophical? When I say philosophical, I mean that there are groups of humans who are incapable of perceiving your perspective of the world. This may be due to religion, culture, language, gender, but mainly lived experiences, which is completely subjective or intersubjective. A good example would be religion, which is a philosophy. Most people in the world who are born into Islam, Christianity, or Judaism cannot fathom the idea that a human would live without putting the idea of a monotheistic God above themselves. That's why they would never marry or start a family with anyone who they perceive to be either outside of their religion, or worse, atheistic. If you ever tried explaining logical arguments to a devout Christian, Muslim, or Jew about evolution or homosexuality, their dogma wouldn't necessarily stem from hatred. It would be a defense to the framework that makes them proud of who they are and what gives them the meaning and direction in their lives, which they would happily die for. So I would say the same for the political left and right. People on the left tend to be more compassionate. They perceive the world as, what if that happened to you? Their opinion is based on a case-by-case scenario and fail to see the bigger picture. Their intentions tend to be good, but their ideas are simply not practical in the real world. A good example would be illegal immigration. Someone on the left might say, what if this immigrant has travelled here from a war-torn country and has had to leave his family behind to be here? They will only view the individual circumstance and fail to see the reality that the world is predominated by people who want to move to Western countries for economic opportunities who are likely to have a different philosophy to the one you think they have. Their philosophy is probably not predicated on tolerance, diversity, equality, or freedom. Their philosophy is likely to be less sophisticated than yours, particularly if they have a poor education, and they probably would rather the whole world to be like them and their own community or society, which is probably a lot more homogenous than yours if you're born in the West. So that means they don't want to learn your language, they're intolerant of other religions, they have archaic views about the roles of women in intimate relationships, they're intolerant of unconventional sexual relationships, they don't want to integrate, and they don't respect your culture or philosophy. In fact, they believe it to be inferior to their own. Now, I'm not saying that I believe this. I'm saying that this is an unfortunate reality which has to be considered with mass migration. I'm saying that it would be naive not to understand that over time, this could ruin the freedoms and privileges you enjoy in the West, and that the topic of mass migration is more complicated than people make out, particularly on the left. I don't think there's any point in criticising some of the viewpoints for people who fall on the far right, as their subscriptions are incompatible with a modern Western society. If you do believe that Europe should be completely white, or that all immigrants should be sent home, or that homosexuals shouldn't be granted the right to have a consensual, intimate relationship, not only are you ignorant, you're just fucking dumb. Well, think about it. Let's say enough people in the West did take that perspective, that all immigrants should be sent home, for example. That would break up second and third generations of immigrants who have settled in the West since World War II. That would destroy the workforce that allows you to enjoy all the conveniences you have that come from relatively cheap labour. So that includes Amazon delivery, Deliveroo, convenience stores, healthcare, taxis, and fast food restaurants, to name a few. And particularly in the UK, I can't see white people wanting to pick up those laborious jobs. It would also destroy international relationships between countries that depend on each other for imported goods. If these hard-working immigrants would summarily be repatriated, how do you think that that's going to sit with foreign governments? Do you think that they're going to want to share those resources with you after this? So that means everything you need to run your smartphones and computers, everything you need to buy affordable clothing, and everything you need to have access to things like medicine. And that's also not considering the vast amount of interracial families that would have to be split up. It's just not practical. It would probably lead to another world war. And don't be stupid enough to believe that countries would become allied based on ethnicity. They would become allied based on philosophy. Have you never wondered why Germany and Japan fought together as part of the Axis powers, even though Hitler idolised the Aryan race characterised by Nordic features such as fair skin, blue eyes and blonde hair? Philosophy. They were both fascist governments. Japan, under Emperor Hirohito and its militarist government, aimed to dominate the Asia-Pacific region. Germany, under Hitler, wanted to expand its territory across Europe, and Italy, under Mussolini, pursued expansion in North Africa and the Mediterranean. That's not to say that white Europeans shouldn't want to protect their culture. They should feel comfortable in their own societies to feel proud of who they are, what makes who they are, and what constituted the freedoms that everyone enjoys when they come to the West. White Europeans have brought some of the greatest minds since the scientific and cultural revolution, such as Copernicus, who proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system, Galileo Galilei, who improved the telescope, René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, Isaac Newton, who formulated the laws of motion and gravity, Voltaire, who advocated for reason, free speech, and separation of the church and state, Immanuel Kant, who developed theories on ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, Charles Darwin, who developed the theory of evolution by natural selection, Friedrich Nietzsche, who explored existentialism, morality, and the will to power, Marie Curie, who pioneered research on radioactivity, Sigmund Freud, who founded psychoanalysis, Albert Einstein, who developed the theory of relativity, and Alan Turing, who helped break the Nazi Enigma code. I was going to say Stephen Hawking, but I don't know if him allegedly jerking off to dwarves on Epstein Island undoes his contribution to black hole physics and cosmology. So yeah, white Europeans have a lot to be proud of. So let's get back to why I'm no longer a liberal. I feel like it's a naive perspective to have. There's no wonder why, particularly in the West, young people start out from the political left, because as their awareness is developing, and as they become educated about the injustices that came from the two world wars, fascism and racism in the 20th century, they develop compassion and understanding of another human's potentially wretched experience, which is pretty wholesome if you ask me. But what a lot of people in the West don't realise is the dangers that come from the far left. I've realised, since I grew up in the West, that a lot of young people are completely ignorant as to what a communist regime looks like. This is probably because after World War II, Europe and America lived in relative peace. They're ignorant of what China went through under Chairman Mao Zedong, and the USA and the Soviet Union were embroiled in a novel kind of war, the Cold War. The Allied powers only ended up winning World War II because the USA won the nuclear arms race. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki devastated Japan to a realization that if they did not surrender, Japan would be obliterated from the face of the planet. Nuclear weapons meant that hegemons like the USA and the Soviet Union no longer needed to rely on small arms and infantry weapons, tanks, artillery, explosives, bomber planes, battleships or submarines, or even missiles manned by civilians to win a war. They now had these nuclear weapons that could decimate parts of the world. That meant that the Cold War was a nuclear arms race between the USA and the Soviet Union, which deterred the need for a conventional military conflict. It was fought out with proxy wars and indirect conflicts, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and both hegemons relied on espionage and propaganda to win the war. The Cold War materialized because the USA and the Soviet Union had philosophical differences. The USA subscribed to democracy and freedom of thought and speech, but the Soviet Union subscribed to communism and totalitarian control over its populace, like China. Chairman Mao Zedong, who founded China in 1949, 4 years after World War II, was won by the Allied powers, was responsible for between 15 to 45 million deaths during what they call the Great Leap Forward, where the implementation of unrealistic production targets, poorly planned communal living, and forced collectivization disrupted traditional farming practices. This led to what they call the Great Chinese Famine. After the dismally failed Great Leap Forward catastrophe, Chairman Mao was responsible for something they call the Cultural Revolution, where Mao reasserted his ideological control over the Chinese Communist Party to purge remnants of traditional, capitalist, and bureaucratic elements from Chinese society. It led to intellectuals, professionals, and perceived political opponents being publicly humiliated, persecuted, or killed. Educational institutions were disrupted, cultural artifacts were destroyed, and had long-term effects on China's political and cultural development. So while Europe and America were enjoying peace after World War II, tens of millions of Chinese people were dying, and the country was living under the dictatorship of their communist leader. The irony being that if you went to China today, their communist propaganda is so effective that most people in China still esteem Chairman Mao, even after being responsible for the deaths of millions of people in China. So yeah, that's the far left. That's how bad it can get. Those of you in the West who believe in large government intervention are impressionable to the degree that you believe the government will always have your best interest at stake. That's not the case. That's why the USA has a constitution and amendments to the constitution to ensure that the government will never have enough power to oppress its own people. That's why a lot of Americans are reluctant to give up their arms. If the government ever did decide to oppress its own people, guns would make that difficult. People who tend to fall more centrist or on the right believe in smaller governments and less intervention with its citizens' daily affairs. People who are more centrist or right are afraid of restricted speech. Restricted speech means the inability to criticize the government. Restricted speech means the inability to talk about things that could improve our societies. There is an understanding that the government will invariably have a conflict of interest to purge political opponents who threaten their hardly fought for power, so the only way we can ensure that the government cannot suppress its people to a totalitarian state is to allow its citizens and its political opponents the absolute freedom of speech, no holds barred. If we have to risk offending people to guarantee us that right and liberty, then so be it. Perhaps you can understand why restricted speech surrounding preferred pronouns is ridiculous. There's bigger fish to fry. People who believe that the right to absolute freedom of speech, what should be an inalienable right in the West, should be relinquished because someone from a minority group might feel offended by words uttered by a stranger they don't even care for, should be tampered with, is naive and is not seeing the bigger picture. Don't get me wrong, having a smaller government or less government intervention would have its side effects. It means more crime, less government handouts, less or no welfare, but it guarantees its citizens more freedom. Centrists or people on the right tend to believe that since we're granted all of these freedoms, there's no excuse for not finding success, as there is nothing stopping us from going out there to figure out how to add value to our society and being fairly remunerated for it. People who are centrist or right have a propensity to believe that people are where they deserve to be, and given there is a motivation to provide for themselves or their family, since the government isn't giving you any free handouts, that should be enough impetus to work harder and smarter, to figure out ways to make money and contribute to society in a positive way. I'm not too sure about the US, but here in the UK there is a horrible demographic of people who claim not to be fit for work, who are receiving free money from the government to exist, while there are others who are working tremendously hard to be able to live and exist in the UK. So while people are working and contributing to society in a positive way, the government is incentivizing people to be lazy, sick or disabled in some way so they can receive free money from the government and to not have to go out and work. Centrist and right politically aligned people do not believe that is fair. Had those who are sponging off the government been told that they will receive no money for not working, they would likely quickly realise how capable they are to work and positively contribute to society. Obviously, we don't want a society where genuinely disabled people or people who are unquestionably unfit to work are unable to have the bare necessities to survive in the West. But the pendulum has definitely swung too far, which is where I stand at least. Before I wrap up this episode, I'd like to externalise my beliefs about a lot of people who I've grown up with or met throughout my life, which include people who have received handouts for over a decade, which contributed to my decision to no longer identify as a liberal. I noticed that a pattern emerged constantly with people who vociferously advocated for the rights of people who they believed to be oppressed. Narcissism. They believed that it was them, out of the 7 billion people on the planet, that was chosen to speak out and fight for the rights and freedoms of the oppressed minority. They all invariably perceived anyone with any remote masculinity or success as an oppressor, irrespective of what positive things that person had contributed to society to gain their success. They all hated white, heterosexual males inherently, even though in the UK, white heterosexual males disproportionately represent the highest suicide rates. And when challenged about their own insecurities, it always happened to be linked to someone else's fault, never their own. If they were overweight because someone subjected them to trauma. If they were poor because they believed to be oppressed by society or the government. And they always turned out to be completely intolerant of anyone whose belief differed to their own. They tended to have strong opinions about political current affairs that did not affect them directly. So they were ready to die on a hill to fix something that had no direct effect on their own lives, even though their own lives were in complete disarray. They always happened to be a victim of some sort and would easily find anyone else to blame for their misfortunes. They're subjected to the whims and vagaries of politics and other people's malevolence on them because, of course, everything's about them. What a depressing existence to have. It's a perspective that means they have zero control over their own lives, well-being or existence, and that they are never to blame for anything. They're perfectly pristine. That's why I no longer identify as a liberal. Thanks for listening.